The autumn rain hammered Chicago's Union Station with relentless fury, turning the massive terminal into a symphony of echoing footsteps, rumbling announcements, and the steady drumbeat of water against glass. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez pulled his olive-green duffel bag higher on his shoulder, the familiar weight of his military gear a comforting presence after 18 months, deployed in the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan. His weathered hands, scarred from countless missions and marked with the calluses of a man who had held both weapons and wounded comrades, gripped the strap tighter as he navigated through the sea of civilians. Beside him, Corporal Jimmy Thompson moved with the measured gait of a soldier who had learned to conserve energy for when it mattered most. At 24, Jimmy's boyish face still carried traces of the farm kid from Wisconsin who had enlisted straight out of high school, but his eyes held the 1,000-yard stare that came from seeing too much, too young. His uniform was pressed to perfection, every crease sharp enough to cut paper, a habit drilled into him during basic training that had become as natural as breathing. The rectangular outline of his mother's letters bulged slightly from his breast pocket, worn soft from being read and reread during long nights in distant foxholes. Lance Corporal Sarah Mitchell flanked Marcus's other side, her auburn hair pulled back in a regulation bun so tight it looked painful, though she never complained. At 22, she was the youngest of the trio, but her marksmanship scores and unwavering calm under fire had earned her the respect of Marines twice her age. The small scar above her left eyebrow, a souvenir from an IED blast outside Kandahar, had faded to a thin white line that she wore like a badge of honor. Her green eyes constantly scanned their surroundings with the hypervigilance that marked all combat veterans, even in the supposed safety of an American train station. The three Marines moved through Union Station like a well-oiled machine, unconsciously, maintaining tactical spacing despite being thousands of miles from any battlefield. Civilians rushed past them with the self-absorbed urgency of people catching trains and meeting deadlines, blissfully unaware that these three young Americans had spent the last year and a half dodging bullets and defusing bombs to protect freedoms that most took for granted. The contrast wasn't lost on any of them, the stark difference between this world of coffee shops and departure boards and the harsh reality of combat zones, where every shadow could conceal death. Marcus checked his watch. 7:23 p.m. Their train to Milwaukee wasn't scheduled to depart until 8:15, giving them nearly an hour to grab dinner and decompress from their cross-country flight. The plan was simple: spend the weekend with Jimmy's family in Wisconsin, eat home-cooked meals, sleep in real beds, and try to readjust to civilian life before their next assignment. It was supposed to be therapeutic, a chance to reconnect with the America they had sworn to defend. But nothing about this weekend would go according to plan. "Jesus, it's loud in here," Jimmy muttered, wincing as a particularly shrill announcement about delayed trains echoed off the vaulted ceiling. His hearing had been compromised by too many explosions, too many nights sleeping next to roaring generators and helicopter engines. The cacophony of normal American life, car horns, construction noise, even children playing off in overwhelmed senses that had been fine-tuned for the subtle sounds of danger. The click of a rifle safety being disengaged, the whisper of footsteps on sand, the barely audible whine of incoming mortar. Sarah nodded sympathetically. She understood. They all did. It was one of the unspoken bonds between them, the way certain sounds could transport them instantly back to the sandbox, the way their hands automatically reached for weapons that weren't there, the way they couldn't fully relax, even in the safest environments. Hypervigilance was both a survival skill and a burden, a gift that had kept them alive overseas, and a curse that made normal life feel perpetually dangerous. "Let's find somewhere quiet to eat," Marcus suggested, his voice carrying the natural authority that had made him an effective leader in combat. At 28, he was the oldest of the group, a career Marine who had already completed 3 deployments before this latest tour. His dark eyes held wisdom earned through experience, and his men followed him not just because of his rank, but because he had repeatedly proven himself willing to make the hard decisions that kept his soldiers alive. They were weaving through a particularly dense crowd near Track 7, when Sarah suddenly stopped dead in her tracks, causing Jimmy to bump into her from behind. "Guys," she said quietly, her voice carrying that particular tension that made both Marines instantly alert. "Look at that dog." Marcus and Jimmy followed her gaze to where a massive German shepherd sat motionless near the platform entrance, as still as a statue carved from shadow and muscle. The animal was enormous, easily 85 pounds of lean strength, with the kind of commanding presence that made people instinctively give him a wide berth. His coat was thick and predominantly black, with rich brown markings around his legs and chest, though it was matted and dirty, suggesting he had been living rough for some time. His ribs were visible beneath his fur, indicating he hadn't been eating regularly, but there was something about his posture that spoke of discipline rather than desperation. What struck them most wasn't his size or his obvious need for food, it was the way he sat. Perfectly straight, head held high, ears at precise attention, front paws aligned with military precision. This wasn't the slouched, defeated posture of a typical stray dog. This was the bearing of a soldier at attention, waiting for orders that might never come. But it was his eyes that truly captured their attention. Amber-colored and intelligent, they seemed to look right through the chaos of the busy station, and focused directly on the 3 Marines with an intensity that was almost unsettling. Those eyes held something that all 3 veterans recognized immediately, the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had seen combat, who had faced death, and survived to carry the weight of those experiences. "Holy shit," Jimmy breathed, forgetting where he was for a moment. "Look at how he's sitting. That's perfect military posture." The German shepherd's ears twitched at the sound of Jimmy's voice, but he didn't move from his position. Instead, his gaze intensified, as if he were evaluating them, taking their measure. In the same way, a drill sergeant might assess new recruits. There was intelligence in those amber eyes, and something else, recognition, perhaps, or hope. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. In 18 months of combat, he had learned to trust his instincts, and every instinct he had was screaming that this was no ordinary encounter. The dog's positioning near their specific track, his military bearing, the way he seemed to be waiting specifically for them, it was too much to be coincidence. When Jimmy whistled softly, the same low 2-note whistle he had used to call military working dogs during their deployment, the German shepherd's response was immediate and unmistakable. His ears snapped to full attention with the precision of a soldier coming to present arms. His head tilted at exactly the angle trained military dogs used when acknowledging their handlers, and his intelligent eyes locked onto Jimmy's face with an intensity that spoke of training, discipline, and purpose. "That's no ordinary stray," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above the station's ambient noise, but carrying the weight of certainty that came from years of military experience. As if he had heard and understood every word, the mysterious German shepherd rose to his feet with fluid grace and began walking directly toward them with the measured, purposeful stride of a soldier reporting for duty. His movement was confident despite his obvious hunger and rough living conditions, and there was something in his approach that made all 3 Marines unconsciously straighten their own posture and prepare for whatever was about to happen next. The German shepherd approached them with the calculated precision of a seasoned operative conducting reconnaissance. Each step was deliberate, measured, his powerful paws making no sound on the polished station floor, despite his considerable size. His amber eyes never left theirs, studying their faces with an intensity that made Marcus feel as though he were being evaluated by a superior officer rather than approached by a stray animal. There was something profoundly unsettling about being assessed so thoroughly by a dog. Yet all three Marines found themselves standing straighter, unconsciously responding to what felt like a military inspection dot. As the distance between them closed, more details became visible that confirmed their growing suspicions. The dog's collar, which had appeared black from a distance, revealed itself to be faded military green with patches of worn fabric that suggested it had once held identification tags and equipment. The name Rex was barely legible, etched into cracked leather that had seen years of hard use. But it was the other markings that made Jimmy's breath catch in his throat. Small metal rings and attachment points that he recognized immediately as hardware designed for tactical gear. "Sarah, give me that sandwich," Marcus said quietly, never taking his eyes off the approaching animal. His voice carried the calm authority of someone accustomed to making quick decisions in uncertain situations. Sarah handed over her turkey club without question, understanding that feeding the dog wasn't just about compassion. It was about establishing communication with what increasingly appeared to be a fellow soldier. Rex stopped exactly 3 feet away, the standard distance military working dogs were trained to maintain when reporting to a new handler. The precision of his positioning sent chills through all 3 Marines. This wasn't learned behavior from living on the streets. This was the result of thousands of hours of professional training, muscle memory that survived even when everything else had been stripped away. As Marcus extended the sandwich, Rex's behavior became even more telling. He didn't lunge for the food like a starving stray would. Instead, he sat first, then looked up at Marcus's face, waiting for permission. Only after Marcus nodded did Rex carefully take the sandwich, eating with controlled bites rather than the desperate gulping of an animal that didn't know when his next meal might come. Even in hunger, discipline prevailed. Jimmy knelt down slowly, his trained eye cataloging details that confirmed his worst fears. The scars across Rex's muzzle weren't random. They formed a specific pattern he'd seen too many times before. "Blast injuries," he murmured, his voice tight with recognition. "These are from improvised explosive devices. Look at the spacing, the way they radiate outward from his nose." He was close to multiple explosions. Sarah joined him at ground level, her gentle hands finding more evidence of Rex's violent past. A slight notch in his left ear where shrapnel had torn through. A patch of fur on his shoulder that grew in different directions, indicating scar tissue beneath. Most telling of all, the way he flinched slightly when sudden sounds echoed through the station, the involuntary startled response of someone who had learned that unexpected noises often preceded danger. His left hind leg, Marcus observed, watching how Rex favored it slightly when shifting position. That's not arthritis or normal wear. That's a combat injury that never healed properly. The limp was subtle, something only another warrior would notice, but it spoke volumes about the battles this dog had endured. Rex seemed to sense their growing understanding. As they examined his injuries, he remained perfectly still, allowing their inspection with the patient resignation of a soldier submitting to medical evaluation. But his eyes never stopped scanning the crowded station behind them, his head turning at every sound, every movement, every potential threat. Even while accepting their care, he was still on duty, still protecting Dot when a security guard's radio crackled to life with a burst of static and urgent chatter about a disturbance in the East Wing. Rex's response was immediate and instinctive. He dropped into a defensive crouch so quickly that all 3 Marines found themselves automatically reaching for weapons that weren't there. His lips pulled back slightly, revealing teeth that could tear through ballistic fabric, while his body coiled with the tension of a loaded spring. This wasn't fear, this was combat readiness, an instant transformation from companion to protector that marked the difference between a pet and a warrior. "Easy, Rex," Jimmy said softly, using the calm, authoritative tone he'd learned from working with military dogs in Afghanistan. Stand down, boy. No threat. The German shepherd's response sent goosebumps racing up Jimmy's arms. Rex immediately relaxed his aggressive posture and looked directly at Jimmy, his amber eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed almost human. He had understood not just the words, but the tactical assessment behind them. This wasn't a dog. That had picked up a few commands from watching police procedurals. This was a highly trained military asset who had been conditioned to respond to combat situations with lethal efficiency. "Jesus Christ," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the station's ambient noise. What kind of operations was he involved in? Marcus was studying the faded tattoo inside Rex's left ear, numbers that were partially obscured by scar tissue, but still partially visible. "These are military service numbers," he said grimly. "But the format? This isn't standard military working dog identification. This is something else entirely." The implications were staggering. Standard military working dogs received basic numerical identification, but the complex alphanumeric sequence, barely visible in Rex's ear, suggested he had been part of something more specialized. Special operations units used different identification protocols for their canine assets, particularly those involved in classified missions where standard military documentation might compromise operational security. Rex continued his protective surveillance of their surroundings, but now his behavior took on new meaning. The way he positioned himself to keep all three Marines in sight while maintaining clear sight lines to potential approach routes. The way he cataloged every person who came within a 30-foot radius, assessing body language and movement patterns with professional efficiency. The way he remained alert to radio chatter and sudden sounds that might indicate developing threats. "Look at how he's watching that businessman," Jimmy noted, observing Rex's focused attention on a man in an expensive suit who was speaking animatedly into his phone while gesturing with his free hand. He's not just people watching. He's conducting threat assessment. The businessman's agitated conversation and erratic movements had triggered Rex's professional interest. His ears were locked onto the man's location, his body slightly tensed, ready to react if the situation escalated. It was the same focused attention Jimmy had witnessed from bomb detection dogs when they identified potential explosive devices complete. Concentration on a specific target that had raised red flags in their highly trained minds. Sarah reached out slowly and placed her hand on Rex's shoulder, feeling the coiled muscle beneath his matted fur. Whatever unit he was with, wherever he served, he saved lives, she said with quiet certainty. "You can see it in everything about him. He's not just a warrior, he's a guardian." As if responding to her words, Rex turned his amber gaze toward her, and for a moment, the professional mask slipped. In his eyes, she saw something that made her throat tighten with emotion, gratitude, recognition, and the deep weariness of someone who had carried impossible burdens for too long. He was a soldier who had never stopped serving. Even after being abandoned by the system, he had sacrificed everything to protect. The boarding announcement for their train echoed through the station, but none of the three Marines moved toward their platform. They had found something, or someone who needed them more than they needed to catch a train. Rex had found them for a reason, and every instinct honed by years of combat was telling them that this encounter was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The final boarding call for train 447 to Milwaukee echoed through Union Station's cavernous halls, its mechanical voice cutting through the evening rush like a blade through fabric. Sarah Mitchell stood frozen beside the German shepherd, her combat boots rooted to the polished marble floor, as if the weight of an impossible decision had physically anchored her in place. Around them, passengers hurried past with rolling suitcases and urgent purpose, but the three Marines existed in a bubble of military brotherhood that transcended species. "We can't leave him here," Sarah declared, her voice carrying the same unwavering determination that had gotten her through 18 months of combat operations in Afghanistan. Her green eyes blazed with the fierce protectiveness that had made her legendary among her unit, for never abandoning a wounded comrade, regardless of the danger. "Look at him, Marcus. He's one of us. He's a veteran who's been left behind." "Jimmy." Thompson shook his head vigorously, his Wisconsin farm boy practicality warring with his soldier's heart. "Sarah, we can't smuggle a dog onto a passenger train. It's against federal transportation regulations, Homeland Security protocols, and probably a dozen other laws I can't even pronounce." His voice cracked slightly on the last words, betraying the internal conflict that was tearing him apart. "They'll arrest us, court-martial us, and probably put Rex down for being an unregistered animal on federal transportation." The German shepherd seemed to understand every word of their heated discussion. Rex's amber eyes moved between the three Marines like a spectator at a tennis match, his intelligent gaze calculating probabilities and assessing options with the methodical precision of a military strategist. His ears swiveled independently, tracking the announcement system, nearby conversations, and the approaching footsteps of station security conducting their routine patrols. Marcus Rodriguez studied the departure board with the focused intensity he had once reserved for mission briefings. Track 7, Car 4, seats 12A through 12C. Their reservation was confirmed, their tickets valid, their military transport orders properly authorized. Everything was regulation. Everything was by the book. Everything was safe and legal, and completely wrong. He had spent his entire adult life following orders, adhering to protocols, and maintaining the discipline that separated Marines from civilians. But standing here beside this forgotten warrior, every regulation felt like a betrayal. "The boarding line is moving," Jimmy observed, his voice tight with anxiety as he watched their fellow passengers disappear through the gate toward their assigned train cars. "If we're going to make a decision, it has to be now. Once that train leaves, the next one isn't until tomorrow morning." Rex rose to his feet with fluid grace, his powerful frame uncoiling like a compressed spring returning to its natural state. Without warning or apparent prompting, he began walking with purposeful strides toward a service corridor that branched off from the main platform area. His movement wasn't random wandering. It was the confident navigation of someone who knew exactly where he was going and had planned this route with military precision. The three Marines exchanged glances that communicated volumes without words. It was the same silent communication that had kept them alive through countless dangerous missions. The ability to read each other's thoughts and intentions through facial expressions and body language, honed by shared combat experience. They had learned to trust each other's instincts implicitly, and every instinct they possessed was screaming that Rex wasn't just showing them a path, he was executing a tactical maneuver. "He's been planning this," Marcus said quietly, his voice filled with growing amazement. "Look at how he's moving. This isn't exploration. This is reconnaissance followed by execution. He's been watching us, studying our situation, and developing a solution." Sarah felt her heart rate increase as the implications sank in. He knew we were military before we identified ourselves. He positioned himself at our specific track, waited for us to approach, and now he's leading us to some kind of alternate route. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "What kind of operational intelligence does this dog possess?" Rex had stopped beside an unmarked door marked "Authorized Personnel Only" in faded yellow letters. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of dimly lit cargo areas beyond. He turned back toward the Marines and executed what could only be described as a perfect military about-face, his amber eyes locking onto theirs with unmistakable communication. "This is the way. Follow me." Jimmy's breath caught in his throat as memories flooded back of working with military dogs in Afghanistan. "I've seen this before," he said, his voice thick with emotion. During night operations, when our K-9 units would scout alternate routes around enemy positions, they would find paths that human intelligence had missed, passages that weren't on any map, but provided tactical advantages our mission planners never could have anticipated. The station's public address system crackled to life again. Last call. For train 447 to Milwaukee, now departing from track 7. All passengers should be aboard immediately. Marcus felt the crushing weight of command decision pressing down on his shoulders. In combat, he had made life-and-death choices in seconds. But those decisions had been guided by clear objectives and established protocols. This was different. This was choosing between regulation and intuition, between following orders and following his heart, between leaving behind a fellow warrior and risking everything for someone who couldn't even speak for himself. Rex sensed his hesitation and took matters into his own hands. The German shepherd moved to the door and used his nose to push it open wider, revealing a freight elevator and cargo loading area that provided access to the train's service cars. The logistics were immediately clear. They could board through the cargo section, avoiding passenger compartments and ticket inspections, traveling in freight cars that were rarely monitored during routine operations. "This is insane," Jimmy muttered, but his feet were already moving toward the door. "We're about to become fugitives on a federal transportation system because a dog we met 20 minutes ago thinks he knows better than Amtrak security protocols." Sarah was already through the door, her military training taking over as she assessed the tactical situation. "The cargo loading area connects directly to the freight cars," she reported quietly. "Minimal security presence, automated systems, and Rex clearly knows the layout better than we do." She paused, looking back at her fellow Marines. "Sometimes you have to break regulations to uphold the oath." The sound of the train's diesel engines rumbling to life reached them through the thin walls of the cargo area. Rex's ears perked up at the familiar sound, and he began moving toward a freight elevator with the confident stride of someone who had done this before. His tail was up, his posture alert but relaxed, and for the first time since they had met, he looked genuinely hopeful. Marcus made his command decision. "Move out, Marines," he said quietly, using the tone that had led men through hellfire and brought them home alive. "We're not leaving anyone behind. Not today, not ever." They followed Rex into the freight elevator as the German shepherd pressed the call button with his nose, a movement so casual and practiced that it was clear he had used this route before. As the elevator descended toward the train loading level, Jimmy realized that Rex wasn't just a former military dog who had gone missing. He was a veteran who had been surviving on his own, using skills and knowledge that suggested he had been part of operations far more complex and classified than any of them had imagined. The elevator doors opened to reveal the underbelly of Union Station's rail operations, a world of cargo containers, freight cars, and service vehicles that operated invisible to the traveling public above. Rex emerged first, checking left and right with the methodical caution of a point man entering potentially hostile territory, before signaling with a slight tail wag that the area was secure. "Welcome to the rabbit hole," Sarah murmured as they stepped into Rex's hidden world, knowing that nothing about their weekend in Wisconsin was going to go according to plan. The freight car that Rex had led them to was a marvel of utilitarian design, 40 feet of reinforced steel that normally carried commercial cargo between Chicago and Milwaukee. Dim emergency lighting cast long shadows across stacks of secured containers and equipment, creating an environment that felt more like a military transport than civilian rail service. The air smelled of diesel fuel, metal, and the faint ozone scent that Marcus recognized from countless helicopter rides in Afghanistan. For the first time since returning to American soil, all three Marines felt genuinely at home. Train 447 pulled away from Union Station. with the steady rhythm that had lulled soldiers to sleep on transport trains for over a century. The familiar clacking of steel wheels on steel rails created a hypnotic percussion that seemed to wash away the stress and hypervigilance that had become second nature during their deployment. The sound was honest and mechanical, free from the unpredictable chaos of combat zones where every noise could signal incoming danger. Rex settled between the three Marines with the practiced ease of a veteran who had traveled this route before. His massive frame relaxed for the first time since they had encountered him, his breathing becoming deep and steady as the train's movement rocked him into something approaching peace. The German shepherd's amber eyes, which had been constantly scanning for threats in the busy station, finally closed as he allowed himself the luxury of rest among fellow warriors, understood the weight he had been carrying alone. Sarah Mitchell sat cross-legged beside Rex, her gentle hands working through the matted sections of his coat with the patient care she had once used to treat wounded soldiers in field hospitals. "Look at this," she whispered, her fingers tracing patterns in his fur that revealed more of his violent history. "These aren't just random scars from living rough. This is shrapnel damage, burn marks from explosions, and surgical scars where metal fragments were removed." Each discovery painted a clearer picture of Rex's service record. The surgical scars were precise and professional, indicating he had received advanced veterinary care from military medical personnel rather than civilian animal hospitals. The pattern of his injuries suggested he had been repeatedly exposed to explosive devices, not just once or twice, but dozens of times over what must have been multiple deployments. Jimmy Thompson shared his combat rations with methodical precision, breaking his MRE into portions sized for a large working dog. "These burn marks on his legs," he observed, pointing to patches where the fur had grown back in different colors and textures. "I've seen identical injuries on dogs that worked IED detection. The closer they get to identifying explosive devices, the more likely they are to be caught in secondary blasts when the bombs detonate." As Jimmy offered him pieces of beef stew from the military meal, Rex's behavior revealed another layer of his professional training. He didn't simply eat. He performed a careful visual and olfactory inspection of each piece before consuming it. The same systematic approach to unfamiliar food that bomb detection dogs were trained to use when working in areas where enemy forces might use poison against military animals. Marcus Rodriguez examined the faded military tattoo inside Rex's left ear with the focused attention of an intelligence analyst. "These numbers," he muttered, using his phone's flashlight to illuminate the partially obscured markings. "I've never seen this format before." Standard military working dogs get simple numerical identification, but this is alphanumeric, and there are way too many characters for basic service records. The identification sequence was unlike anything in Marcus's experience, and he had worked with military dogs during 2 previous deployments. A format suggested Rex had been part of a specialized program that operated under different protocols than standard military units. The complexity of the identification system implied compartmentalized security clearances and operational classifications that went far beyond normal military working dog assignments. "Special operations," Sarah said quietly, her voice filled with growing amazement. He wasn't just a regular military working dog. He was part of something classified, something that required advanced security protocols and specialized identification systems. The implications were staggering. Special operations forces used military working dogs for missions that never appeared in official records: deep reconnaissance in enemy territory, classified intelligence gathering, and operations that required the kind of advanced training and intelligence that Rex had been demonstrating since they first encountered him. As the train picked up speed through the Illinois countryside, Rex's breathing became steady and deep, but his ears remained in constant motion, tracking sounds that the human passengers couldn't even hear. His professional awareness never completely shut down, even in sleep. It was the conditioned response of someone who had learned that relaxation could mean death, that vigilance was the price of survival in a world where enemies never rested. Rhythmic clacking of the train wheels created a peaceful soundtrack that seemed to wash away months of accumulated stress and hypervigilance. For the first time since returning from deployment, Marcus felt his shoulders truly relax. Jimmy's perpetual tension headaches began to fade as the steady motion of the train replaced the chaotic sensory overload of civilian environments. Sarah's constant scanning for threats gradually decreased as the enclosed environment and Rex's protective presence allowed her nervous system to finally stand down from combat readiness. "This feels right," Jimmy said quietly, his voice barely audible above the train's mechanical symphony. "For the first time since we got back stateside, everything feels normal. Like we're where we're supposed to be." The observation was profound. In its simplicity, the three Marines had been struggling with the transition from combat to civilian life, finding themselves constantly on edge in environments that should have felt safe. But here, in this freight car with a fellow warrior, surrounded by the honest sounds of mechanical transportation, they had found a piece of the peace that had been eluding them since their return. Rex seemed to sense their emotional shift. His massive head lifted slightly, and he opened one amber eye to check on each of his new companions. Satisfied that they were safe and settling into rest, he allowed himself to drift deeper into sleep, his powerful body finally releasing the tension he had been carrying since his abandonment. The train continued its journey through the darkening Illinois landscape, passing small towns and farmland that glowed with the warm light of kitchen windows and front porches. It was the America they had fought to protect, peaceful, prosperous, and blissfully unaware of the sacrifices that had been made to preserve its tranquility. But beneath the surface calm, warning signs were beginning to manifest that none of them were trained to recognize. The train's speed was gradually increasing beyond normal operational parameters. The engineers' radio communications were becoming more frequent and urgent. Deep within the locomotive's mechanical systems, safety protocols were beginning to fail in ways that would soon demand every ounce of training, an instinct that the three Marines and their canine companion possessed. Rex's ears suddenly twitched, responding to something that registered below the threshold of human hearing. His amber eyes snapped open, and every muscle in his powerful body tensed as his subconscious mind processed information that his conscious awareness couldn't yet identify. Something was wrong, something subtle, but significant enough to trigger the alarm systems that had kept him alive through countless dangerous missions. The rhythmic clacking of the train wheels was changing, becoming irregular in ways that spoke of mechanical stress in developing problems. Rex's nostrils flared as he detected scents that didn't belong, the sharp ozone smell of overheating electrical systems, the acrid bite of brake components being pushed beyond their design limits, and something else that made his hackles rise. With primitive alarm. For 40 minutes, everything had seemed perfect. The three warriors had finally found peace, and they had rescued a fellow veteran from abandonment and despair. But Rex's sudden alertness carried a message that none of them wanted to acknowledge. Their brief respite from danger was about to end in ways that would test every skill they had learned in combat and push their brotherhood to its absolute limits. The calm before the storm was ending, and the storm that was coming would require everything they had learned about courage, sacrifice, and never leaving anyone behind. The train's intercom system crackled to life with a distinctive electronic squeal that preceded official announcements, a sound that made all three Marines unconsciously straighten their postures. Static filled the freight car for several long seconds before the conductor's voice emerged, artificially calm and measured in the way that professional transportation personnel were trained to deliver potentially alarming information without causing panic among passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, We are currently experiencing minor technical difficulties with our braking systems and will be making an unscheduled stop for routine maintenance procedures. We apologize for any inconvenience this may cause and appreciate your patience as our engineering team addresses these issues. We expect to resume normal operations within approximately 20 to 30 minutes. The announcement ended with another burst of static, followed by silence that felt heavier than the words that had preceded it. To civilian passengers in the aisle, forward cars, the message would have sounded like a standard delay, frustrating, but not alarming. But to 3 combat veterans who had spent 18 months learning to read between the lines of official communications, every word carried ominous implications that civilian ears would miss entirely. Rex wasn't buying any of it. The German Shepherd had been resting peacefully just moments before, his massive frame relaxed and his breathing steady. But the instant the intercom crackled to life, he had snapped into full alertness with the instantaneous transformation from rest to readiness that marked elite military operatives. His amber eyes were now locked onto the small speaker mounted near the freight car's ceiling, his intelligent gaze analyzing not just the words, but the subtle, vocal stress patterns that revealed the speaker's true emotional state. The dog's behavior was becoming increasingly agitated in ways that sent ice water through Jimmy Thompson's veins. Rex began pacing frantically within the confines of their freight car, his powerful paws making soft padding sounds on the metal floor as he moved back and forth with the measured urgency of a soldier conducting damage assessment. His ears were rotating independently, tracking multiple audio sources simultaneously, the intercom system, mechanical sounds from the train's infrastructure, and radio communications bleeding through from the engineer's compartment. But it was the sound Rex was making that froze Jimmy's blood in his arteries. The German Shepherd had begun producing a low, continuous whine that started deep in his chest and built in intensity and pitch until it resembled the alert signal that military working dogs used when they detected improvised explosive devices. Jimmy had heard that exact sound dozens of times during their deployment in Afghanistan, always in the moments before their convoys came under attack or when hidden bombs were discovered along patrol routes. "Rex, what is it, boy?" Sarah whispered urgently, but her voice carried the tight control of someone who already knew the answer would be nothing good. She had seen enough military working dogs in action to recognize that Rex's behavior wasn't random anxiety or confusion about their unusual travel situation. This was the systematic alert protocol of a highly trained detection specialist who had identified a threat that human senses couldn't perceive. The German Shepherd's pacing became more urgent, and his whining escalated to short, sharp barks that followed the precise pattern military dogs used to communicate specific types of danger to their handlers. 3 short barks, pause, 2 long barks, pause, repeat. Jimmy's hands began trembling as muscle memory translated the signal. Catastrophic mechanical failure. Immediate evacuation required. Extreme danger to all personnel. Through the small reinforced window of the freight car, Marcus Rodriguez could see they were approaching a section of track that made his combat-trained instincts scream warnings. The rails ahead descended at a steep angle through a landscape of rocky outcroppings and dense forest terrain. It would be challenging for emergency responders to access and impossible for passengers to survive if something went catastrophically. Round out the train was picking up speed in ways that violated every safety protocol Marcus had ever learned about railway operations. Instead of slowing down for the announced maintenance stop, they were accelerating beyond the safe operational limits for this section of track. The rhythmic clacking of steel wheels on steel rails was becoming more rapid and more irregular, suggesting that the locomotive systems were no longer under proper control. Rex's alert barking reached a fever pitch, and he began pawing desperately at the freight car's door handle with the frantic energy of someone trying to escape a burning building. His behavior had escalated beyond simple threat detection to active emergency response protocols. Every instinct in his highly trained body was screaming that they needed to evacuate immediately, that remaining in their current location would result in death or serious injury within minutes. Jimmy's stomach dropped into his boots as fragments of overheard radio communications began filtering through the train's internal communication system. The words were fragmented and partially obscured by static, but his military communications training allowed him to piece together enough to understand the scope of their crisis. ... Primary braking system failure. ... Backup systems not responding. ... Emergency protocols initiated. ... All stations be advised. ... Guys, Jimmy said quietly, his voice carrying the deadly calm that combat veterans used when discussing imminent threats to their survival. I think we're in serious trouble. Rex is trying to warn us about something catastrophic, and based on what I'm hearing from the radio chatter, I don't think this is a routine maintenance issue. Sarah moved to the window and peered out at the landscape rushing past at increasingly dangerous speeds. The terrain they were entering was notorious among railway personnel, a section known informally as Devil's Grade, with a combination of steep descents, sharp curves, and challenging geography, had been the site of 3 major derailments in the past 2 decades. Under normal circumstances, trains navigated this section at reduced speeds with multiple safety protocols in place, but their current velocity was far beyond safe parameters for this terrain. Rex had stopped pacing and was now standing directly in front of the maintenance ladder that led to an access hatch in the freight car's roof. His amber eyes locked onto Jimmy's with unmistakable communication. This is our escape route. This is how we survive. Follow me now, or we all die together in approximately 60 seconds. The German Shepherd's positioning wasn't random. He had calculated their options with the methodical precision of a military strategist and determined that their only chance for survival lay in abandoning the train before it reached the point of no return. His special operations training had included scenarios that most military personnel never encountered, situations where standard evacuation procedures were inadequate, and creative solutions meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Through the increasingly frantic radio communications bleeding through the train's speakers, they caught fragments that confirmed their worst fears. ... Unable to establish contact with engineer ... All emergency braking systems offline ... Recommend immediate evacuation of all personnel ... Catastrophic derailment imminent ... Marcus grabbed the emergency radio mounted near the freight car's control panel and tried to establish communications with the engineering compartment. This is Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, United States Marines, aboard Freight Car 7. Request immediate status update on current emergency situation and evacuation procedures. The radio crackled with static for several long seconds before a panicked voice responded. All military personnel, this is Engineer Davidson. We have complete brake failure on a 40-car freight and passenger train approaching Devil's Grade at approximately 85 miles per hour. All safety systems are offline. We cannot stop this train. Recommend immediate emergency evacuation by any means necessary. Repeat, abandon train immediately. Catastrophic derailment is imminent. Rex locked eyes with Jimmy and barked once the military signal that meant execute immediately. No questions, no hesitation. The German Shepherd's message was crystal clear. Their window for survival was measured in seconds, not minutes, and anyone who hesitated would not live to regret the decision. They had less than 60 seconds to make a choice. That would determine whether they lived or died, and their survival depended entirely on trusting the tactical assessment of a dog whose specialized training had prepared him for exactly this type of impossible situation. The small reinforced window of the freight car became a portal to hell as Marcus Rodriguez pressed his face against the glass and witnessed something that made his combat-hardened soul recoil in terror. Through the rain-streaked surface, he could see the track ahead curving sharply to the right around a rocky cliff face, a turn that freight trains were supposed to navigate at no more than 35 miles per hour under optimal conditions. But train 447 was screaming toward that deadly curve at nearly 90 miles per hour, a speed that would transform their 40-car convoy into a twisted monument of twisted steel and human tragedy. The laws of physics were immutable and unforgiving. At their current velocity, the centrifugal forces generated by attempting to navigate Devil's Curve would overcome the lateral stability of every car on the train. The locomotive would leave the rails first, followed by a catastrophic chain reaction. That would send passenger cars tumbling down a 100-foot embankment into a rocky gorge that emergency responders would need hours to reach. Anyone still aboard when the train hit that curve would experience approximately 3 seconds of weightlessness before impact forces that no human body could survive. Through the train's damaged communication system, Engineer Davidson's voice cut through the static with the desperate clarity of a man facing his own mortality. "Mayday, Mayday. This is train 447 to all emergency services. We have complete brake failure on a 40-car passenger and freight train approaching Devil's Grade at unsafe speed. All safety systems are offline. We cannot stop. Repeat, we cannot stop this train." The radio crackled with responses from multiple emergency agencies, but their efforts were meaningless against the fundamental reality of momentum and gravity. Fire departments were scrambling to position equipment at the bottom of the gorge. Medical helicopters were being dispatched from 3 different hospitals. The National Transportation Safety Board was activating their emergency response protocols. But none of their preparations would matter for anyone still aboard the train. When it reached the curve in approximately 45 seconds, Rex's barking had reached a fever pitch that transcended normal canine communication and entered the realm of pure emergency signal transmission. His specialized training had prepared him for scenarios that existed at the intersection of military operations and natural disasters, situations where conventional evacuation procedures were inadequate and survival required immediate action. Based on tactical assessment rather than standard protocols, the German Shepherd was no longer just alerting them to danger. He was providing specific, tactical guidance for their only possible survival strategy. Rex positioned himself directly beneath the maintenance ladder that led to the freight car's roof access hatch. His amber eyes locked onto each Marine in turn, with communication that was more precise than verbal orders. "You have 30 seconds to execute this evacuation procedure, or you will all die in the derailment." Jimmy Thompson's hands were shaking as he reached for the ladder rungs, not from fear, but from the adrenaline surge that his body had learned to generate during life-threatening emergencies. His military training had conditioned him to function at peak efficiency during crisis situations, but this was unlike anything he had experienced in Afghanistan. Combat operations involved human enemies who could be outmaneuvered, outsmarted, or outfought. But they were now facing the absolute certainty of physics and mechanical failure, forces that couldn't be negotiated with or defeated through superior tactics. "Sarah, Marcus, we have to move now," Jimmy shouted over the increasing noise of the speeding train and Rex's urgent barking. "Rex is showing us an escape route, and we have maybe 20 seconds before we're committed to riding this death trap all the way to the bottom of Devil's Gorge." Sarah Mitchell was already moving toward the ladder with the efficient urgency she had learned during medical evacuations under fire. Her combat medic training had taught her to make life or death decisions in seconds, but those situations had involved saving other people's lives. This was different. This was pure survival. The most basic instinct of any living creature faced with imminent extinction. Rex had somehow calculated that their only chance for survival lay in abandoning the train before it reached the point where centrifugal forces would make escape impossible. His special operations training had included scenarios involving emergency evacuation from moving vehicles under extreme conditions, situations where the margin for error was measured in fractions of seconds rather than minutes or hours. Marcus grabbed the emergency radio one final time and transmitted what he hoped wouldn't be his last communication. "This is Staff Sergeant Rodriguez to any emergency personnel monitoring this frequency. 3 United States Marines are attempting emergency evacuation from Freight Car 7 of Train 447. We are approximately 15 seconds from catastrophic derailment at Devil's Curve. If we survive this evacuation attempt, we will need immediate medical assistance at coordinates ... He rattled off their approximate position based on GPS readings from his military watch. Through the freight car's speakers, they could hear panicked voices from the passenger compartments as civilians began to understand that their routine train journey had become a race against death. Children were crying, adults were shouting contradictory instructions, and the overall cacophony of human panic was building to a crescendo that would end abruptly when the train left the rails and began its final fatal descent. Rex had already begun climbing the maintenance ladder with the agility and determination of a soldier, executing a precisely planned tactical maneuver. His powerful claws found purchase on the metal rungs, and his muscular frame moved upward with surprising speed, despite his size and the train's violent motion. At the top, he used his nose and paws to manipulate the roof access hatch, revealing a rectangular opening that led to the top of the speeding freight car. The German Shepherd turned back toward the 3 Marines and barked the most urgent command. In military working dog communication, execute immediately, follow my lead, trust my tactical assessment. Because hesitation means death for all of us. Wind and rain from the approaching storm lashed through the open hatch, creating a maelstrom of noise and motion that made communication nearly impossible. But Rex's message was unmistakable as he positioned himself at the edge of the opening. This is your escape route. This is how you survive. I will show you where to jump and when to jump, but you must follow my lead without question or hesitation. The sound of the train wheels on the track was changing from the rhythmic clacking of normal operations to the high-pitched shriek of metal being stressed beyond its design limits. The locomotive's whistle was blowing continuously now, not as a signal to other traffic, but as a final warning to anyone within hearing distance that a catastrophe was about to unfold that would be visible for miles and remembered for decades. The chaos of wind, rain, and mechanical noise, they could hear Engineer Davidson's final transmission. 10 seconds to impact. All personnel abandon train immediately. This is our last. The radio went silent. Rex locked eyes with Jimmy. Thompson embarked once the military signal for execute now. No questions, complete trust. The German Shepherd's amber gaze held absolute certainty. I know exactly what we need to do. I know exactly when we need to do it. And if you follow my lead without hesitation, we will all survive this impossible situation. But they had to move now. They had to trust completely. And they had to execute a tactical maneuver that would either save their lives or add their names to the casualty list of one of the worst railway disasters in American transportation history. Rex didn't hesitate for even a microsecond. The German Shepherd emerged from the roof hatch onto the top of the speeding freight car with the fluid grace of a special operations warrior executing a maneuver he had rehearsed thousands of times in training scenarios that most military personnel never experienced. The wind from their 90-mile-per-hour velocity hit him like a physical wall, flattening his ears against his skull and forcing his eyes into protective squints. But his powerful legs maintained perfect balance on the rain-slicked metal surface. Whirled above the train was a nightmare of sound and motion. Hurricane-force winds generated by their excessive speed mixed with the natural storm front, moving through the Illinois countryside, creating a maelstrom of horizontal rain, debris, and mechanical noise that made normal communication impossible. The freight car's roof bucked and swayed with violent irregularity as the train's suspension system struggled to maintain stability on track that was never designed for such extreme velocities. Rex moved to the edge of the car with the calculated precision of a military tactician conducting reconnaissance under fire. His amber eyes scanned the terrain rushing past below them, analyzing topography, calculating impact angles, and identifying the optimal landing zone with the methodical expertise of someone whose survival had depended on making split-second tactical assessments in combat environments where a single miscalculation meant death. To the left of the track lay rocky outcroppings and scattered boulders that would shatter bones on impact. To the right stretched a marshy wetland area that extended from the railway embankment toward a distant tree line. The marsh represented their only chance for survival, soft ground that might absorb enough impact energy to prevent fatal injuries. Assuming they could time their jump to avoid the rocks and reach the water-saturated soil, but the margin for error was terrifyingly narrow. Jump too early, and they would hit solid ground at lethal velocity. Jump too late, and they would be caught in the centrifugal forces that would drag them into the derailment. Rex had perhaps 3 seconds to identify the optimal moment, the brief window, when the train's position would allow them to clear the rocky embankment and land in the marsh. Sarah Mitchell emerged from the hatch behind Rex, her combat medic training overriding her natural fear as she assessed their tactical situation. The wind immediately tried to tear her from the roof, but her military conditioning allowed her to maintain balance while moving toward Rex's position. The marsh! She shouted over the mechanical thunder, recognizing Rex's tactical assessment. He's calculated the landing zone. Jimmy Thompson followed Sarah onto the roof, his farm boy strength and military training combining to keep him upright in conditions that would have been impossible for civilian passengers. Through the chaos of wind and noise, he could see the sharp curve ahead, Devil's Curve, where the track bent around a cliff face in a turn and was about to become the site of a catastrophic derailment. Marcus Rodriguez was the last to emerge. And as he reached the roof, he could see the full scope of their impossible situation. The locomotive was already entering the curve, its massive weight and momentum carrying it beyond the safe limits of the track's design parameters. Physics was about to demonstrate its absolute authority over human engineering, and anyone still aboard the train in 10 seconds would experience forces that no biological organism could survive. Rex positioned himself at the edge of the freight car roof, his powerful muscles coiled like loaded springs as he calculated wind resistance, trajectory, angles, and ground conditions with the precision of a ballistics computer. His special operations training had included high-altitude parachute jumps, helicopter insertions under fire, and emergency evacuations from moving vehicles, scenarios that had prepared him for exactly this type of impossible tactical challenge. German Shepherd looked back at the 3 Marines with eyes that conveyed absolute certainty. I know exactly when to jump, exactly where to land, and exactly how to survive this impact. Follow my lead without question, trust my tactical assessment completely, and we will all live through this nightmare. Rex's jump was a masterpiece of military precision. He launched himself from the roof with the calculated trajectory of a guided missile, his powerful legs propelling him away from the train at the exact angle needed to clear the rocky embankment and reach the marsh. His body remained rigid during flight, positioned to absorb maximum impact across his muscular frame rather than concentrating force on vulnerable joints or organs. the German Shepherd hit the marshy ground with a splash that sent mud and water erupting in all directions. He rolled with the impact, using techniques that had been drilled into him during airborne training, spreading the energy of his landing across his entire body rather than allowing it to concentrate in ways that could cause fractures or internal injuries. Within seconds, he was on his feet, shaking off mud and immediately turning to guide the Marine's jumps. Sarah followed Rex's example, her combat medic training having included emergency evacuation procedures that prepared her for exactly this type of crisis. She launched herself from the roof with the same calculated precision, aiming for the spot where Rex had demonstrated the safest landing technique. Her impact was harder than Rex's due to her different body mechanics, but her military conditioning allowed her to roll with the force and emerge with only minor injuries. Jimmy's jump was powered by 18 months of combat conditioning and a lifetime of farm work that had built functional strength in every muscle fiber. He hit the marsh with tremendous force, driving himself deep into the mud and water, but the soft ground absorbed enough energy to prevent catastrophic injury. He emerged gasping and covered in muck, but alive and mobile. Marcus was the final jumper, and as he prepared to launch himself from the disintegrating train, he could see that they had perhaps 2 seconds before the locomotive left the rails and began its fatal tumble into Devil's Gorge. His jump was more desperation than calculation, a final leap of faith that carried him clear of the rocky embankment and into the marsh just as the train behind him began its catastrophic transformation from transportation to twisted wreckage. The 4 survivors hit the muddy ground in rapid succession, their impacts sending shock waves through the waterlogged soil that absorbed kinetic energy that would have been fatal on solid ground. Rex was immediately mobile, limping toward each Marine to conduct rapid medical assessment with the systematic approach of a combat medic checking casualties after an explosion. Behind them, Train 447 entered Devil's Curve at 87 miles per hour, more than double the safe speed for that section of track. The locomotive's wheels lost contact with the rails as centrifugal force overcame the limited grip of steel on steel. What followed was a symphony of destruction that could be heard for miles. The thunderous crash of 40 cars leaving the track simultaneously, the explosive percussion of freight containers rupturing on impact, and the grinding shriek of metal being torn apart by forces that exceeded every engineering specification. The freight car they had escaped from, Car 7, was among the first to tumble down the embankment, its roof crushed flat as it rolled end over end before coming to rest, upside down in a twisted configuration that would have instantly killed anyone still inside. The passenger cars that followed created a pile of wreckage that rose 30 feet above the bottom of the gorge, a monument to the catastrophic power of physics unleashed without restraint. Rex stood guard over his 3 wounded Marines as emergency sirens began wailing in the distance. His amber eyes surveyed their injuries with professional assessment. Sarah had a dislocated shoulder, but was conscious and alert. Jimmy had sustained a concussion and multiple lacerations, but was responsive to verbal commands. Marcus had suffered what appeared to be cracked ribs and a sprained ankle, but was breathing normally and maintaining coherent communication. All 4 survivors were alive, mobile, and breathing an outcome that defied every statistical probability associated with train derailments at such extreme velocities. They had survived because a highly trained German Shepherd had calculated their escape with military precision and executed a tactical evacuation that had required perfect timing, absolute trust, and courage that transcended the normal boundaries between species. As the first emergency responders reached their position, Rex maintained his protective stance over the 3 Marines who had trusted his tactical assessment with their lives. The German Shepherd had kept his promise. He had brought them all home alive. The silence that followed the catastrophic derailment was more terrifying than the thunderous destruction that had preceded it. For nearly 30 seconds, the Illinois countryside held its breath as settling debris created a series of smaller crashes and metallic groans that echoed through Devil's Gorge like the death rattles of a mechanical giant. Then the human sounds began, distant sirens growing closer, helicopter rotors cutting through the storm-laden air, and the urgent radio chatter of emergency responders coordinating the largest railway disaster response in the state's history. Rex maintained his protective stance over the 3 wounded Marines, his amber eyes constantly scanning their perimeter for additional threats while his trained nose analyzed the chemical smells rising from the wreckage. Diesel fuel, hydraulic fluid, and the acrid smoke of electrical fires created a toxic cocktail that his sensitive detection systems recognized as potentially dangerous. But his primary concern remained the medical status of his new pack members, each of whom he assessed with the systematic approach of a combat medic conducting triage under fire. Sarah Mitchell was struggling to reset her dislocated shoulder, using a technique she had learned during field medicine training, her face pale, but determined as she worked through the procedure with gritted teeth. "Rex saved our lives," she gasped between waves of pain, her green eyes reflecting a mixture of agony and profound gratitude. He calculated everything: the timing, the landing zone, the trajectory. Without his tactical assessment, we would have been paced on the rocks or crushed in that wreckage. The first emergency responder to reach their position was a paramedic named David Chun, whose helicopter had been diverted from a routine medical transport when the vice. Initial distress calls began flooding emergency frequencies. What he found in the marshy ground beside the twisted remains of Train 447 defied every assumption he had developed about railway disaster survival rates during his 15-year career in emergency medicine. "Jesus Christ," Chun breathed as he surveyed the scene, his professional composure cracking for just a moment before his training reasserted control. "How did you people survive a derailment at that velocity? The physics should have been impossible." His experienced eyes moved between the 4 survivors, 3 humans with injuries that were serious but survivable, and 1 German shepherd who appeared to have coordinated their escape with military precision. Jimmy Thompson, despite his concussion and multiple lacerations, was coherent enough to provide Chun with a tactical briefing that sounded more like a military operation report than a civilian accident narrative. "The dog identified the threat before our instruments detected the brake failure," he explained, his voice steady despite the blood trickling from a scalp wound. "Rex executed a tactical evacuation that included threat assessment, route selection, timing coordination, and protective overwatch during our escape sequence. As more emergency personnel arrived, the scope of Train 447's destruction became fully apparent. 43 railway cars scattered across a quarter-mile area, with the locomotive buried under 30 feet of twisted metal at the bottom of Devil's Gorge. Initial casualty estimates were staggering: 87 passengers and crew members, hospitalized with injuries ranging from minor to critical, but remarkably, only 3 fatalities, all of whom had been in the locomotive cab when the initial derailment occurred. The investigation that followed would take 8 months to complete and involve experts from the USA, National Transportation Safety Board, the Federal Railroad Administration, and independent engineering consultants who specialized in catastrophic mechanical failures. What they discovered fundamentally changed railway safety protocols across the entire American transportation system and elevated Rex from a homeless stray to a national hero whose actions had prevented what could have been the deadliest train disaster in United States history. The brake failure had been caused by a cascade of mechanical problems that began with a software glitch in the locomotive's primary control systems. When the computerized braking system failed, the backup mechanical system should have engaged automatically. But corrosion in critical hydraulic Lines corrosion that had been missed during routine inspections meant that the backup systems were equally compromised. The result was a 40-car train with no operational braking capability approaching. One of the most dangerous sections of track in the Midwest, and nearly twice the safe speed limit. Rex's extraordinary intervention had saved not just 3 Marines, but potentially dozens of additional lives. His early warning had allowed engineer Davidson to transmit distress signals that enabled emergency responders to position medical teams and equipment at optimal locations around the crash site. His tactical guidance had demonstrated that survival was possible under seemingly impossible circumstances, inspiring other passengers to attempt their own emergency evacuations that might not have been attempted without his example. The media coverage that followed transformed Rex from a forgotten military asset into a symbol of heroism that transcended species boundaries. CNN, Fox News, NBC, and every major network broadcast his story during primetime coverage that reached over 40 million Americans. The narrative of a special operations military working dog saving 3 combat veterans resonated with audiences who were hungry for stories about loyalty, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds forged between warriors who had served together in dangerous places. But it was the investigation into Rex's background that revealed the true scope of his extraordinary service record. Military personnel records, declassified, after extensive lobbying by veterans advocacy groups, showed that Rex had served 4 combat deployments across 3 different theaters of operation. He had been credited with detecting over 200 improvised explosive devices, saving countless lives through his detection work, and participating in classified special operations missions that had disrupted enemy networks and protected American forces throughout the Middle East. Rex's official military service record included 3 combat deployments in Iraq, 1 deployment in Afghanistan, specialized training at facilities that remained classified, and medical treatment for combat injuries that included blast trauma, chemical exposure, and psychological conditioning that addressed the canine equivalent of post-traumatic stress disorder. He had been retired from active service due to age and accumulated injuries, but his transport to a military working dog retirement facility had been compromised when the vehicle carrying him was involved in an accident outside Chicago. Rex had escaped during the confusion and had been surviving independently for over 8 months, using skills and knowledge that reflected the highest levels of military training. The White House ceremony, 6 months after the derailment, was attended by over 300 distinguished guests, including senior military officials, railway industry executives, emergency responders who had participated in the rescue operation, and family members of passengers whose lives had been saved by Rex's heroic intervention. President Williams delivered remarks that were broadcast live to a national television audience and later preserved in the National Archives as a testament to the extraordinary service of American military working dogs. Rex represents the very best of American military tradition, the president declared, as Rex sat at attention beside Marcus Rodriguez, wearing a specially designed metal harness that displayed his new decoration alongside ribbons, representing his previous combat service. His actions on that terrible night remind us that heroism knows no boundaries, that loyalty transcends species, and that the bonds forged between warriors in service to our nation endure long after their official duties have ended. Rex received the Animals in War and Peace Medal of Bravery, becoming only the 4th civilian animal in United States history to be honored with the nation's highest recognition for non-human military service. The ceremony was emotionally overwhelming for everyone present, but particularly for the 3 Marines whose lives Rex had saved through his tactical intervention and unwavering courage under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Marcus Rodriguez formally adopted Rex through a process that involved extensive background checks, psychological evaluations, and coordination with multiple government agencies responsible for the welfare of retired military working dogs. The German Shepherd now lived peacefully on Marcus's ranch in Texas, where his days were spent providing therapy and emotional support to other combat veterans who struggled with the psychological aftermath of military service. The ranch had become an unofficial gathering place for military working dog handlers, combat veterans dealing with post-traumatic stress, and researchers studying the therapeutic benefits of human-animal bonds in treating war-related psychological trauma. Rex served as both a therapy animal and a living symbol of resilience, demonstrating daily that survival was possible even after experiencing the worst that war and disaster could inflict. Sarah Mitchell visited the ranch monthly, bringing medical supplies and conducting health assessments that ensured Rex's continued well-being. Jimmy Thompson had relocated to Texas specifically to remain close to the German Shepherd, who had saved his life, finding employment as a ranch hand and discovering that working with Rex and other therapy animals provided the sense of purpose that had been missing since his return from combat. On quiet evenings, the four survivors would sit together on Marcus's front porch, watching Texas sunsets paint the sky in colors that reminded them of the beauty that existed alongside the violence they had all experienced. Rex would position himself protectively among his three Marines, his amber eyes still scanning for threats that might never come, his powerful body still ready to defend the pack that had become his family. The bond forged in those terrifying seconds aboard Train 447 had evolved into something deeper than friendship or gratitude. It had become a brotherhood that included a species other than human, a warrior whose heroism had reminded an entire nation that some values transcended the boundaries that typically separated different forms of life. Rex had not just saved 3 Marines that night. He had demonstrated that courage, loyalty, and sacrifice were universal languages spoken by all creatures capable of love.